this isn't happening in red states like, the National Guard troops going into places like Chicago and even in Oregon. Those are two blue states. Um, so there's certain things that you could point to and say, certainly this isn't happening in red states. I don't know if I'm comfortable saying that in a broad scope, but there are
Hmm.
definitely, little examples that you can certainly point to.
So Ben Machi, thank you for joining me on the program today. Um, Look, I mean, you cover Illinois from WAND News. Tell me, who in the state qualifies for food stamps? Who relies on these food stamps?
Yeah, John. So the general requirements for food stamps, not just in Illinois, but in the country as a whole, is a family of three. If you make less than $35,000 a year, that's the general requirement. There's, a couple of other specific things that can help you or hurt you in that requirement, but that's generally what it is. So in Illinois specifically, it's about 1.9 million people that really need these food stamps, these SNAP benefits to be able to eat and feed their family in a sufficient way.
Right, that's a pretty large number of people. Are we talking about families where the parents are out of work, suffering significant poverty?
Yeah, it can be just out of work or just your income isn't high enough. It can be either of those things. That's something that, part of this big, beautiful bill from President Donald Trump and Republicans is, they want to make sure that they're not giving these benefits to people that just don't want to work. That's kind of where some of, this back and forth is coming from. But yes, it can be just people that can't find a job or that they just don't make enough.
Right, and the expectation is this access to food stamps, which so many people seem to rely on, that will be pulled away, that will be cut as the shutdown continues.
Yeah, absolutely. Yesterday it came out that the USDA says that these benefits will not be paid out on November 1st. That's on Saturday. $8 billion in food stamps nationwide are supposed to go out on November 1st. There's about a $5 billion contingency fund that the USDA has for things like this, but the USDA said yesterday that it will not use money from that contingency fund, that money is just for emergencies like natural disasters. There's a hurricane that looks like could hit the United States here shortly. Nationwide, it's 40 million people, not just the 2 million here in Illinois. So yes, it's a real fear that come Saturday, there will not be the money that these families really do rely on.
Okay, and it seems like an obvious question because I suppose it is. But is the expectation then, if this funding for food stamps is pulled, you'll now see, well, a lot of families in your state and elsewhere going without the food they need just to keep going. You'll see a shortage of food. You'll see malnutrition among these people. Is that the assumption?
Yeah, I think that that's a pretty fair assumption. Some states have said that if the federal government doesn't pay out, that they will supplement it. Illinois has said we don't have the money to supplement this the SNAP benefits. So yes, I think it's certainly a fair assumption that these families that rely on these SNAP benefits, on these food stamps, will not be able to feed themselves sufficiently in the way that they have been previously.
Right. And what about the political fallout from this? Because Illinois is a Democrat state, it's a blue state. And there are suggestions that, well, blue states are particularly in the crosshairs of the administration.
Yeah, I mean that's certainly, a point to consider. I think some people certainly view this as a way for Republicans to try to, maybe strong arm isn't the correct word, but that line of thinking into getting Democrats to vote with them on this stopgap funding bill to reopen the government.
Mm.
At the state level, there's not much that can be done outside of supplementing it themselves, but the state has said that they just don't have the money. So, again, like a lot of things, it's going to come back to the federal government to see if they can come up with a stopgap funding bill. The Senate is back in session this week, although a vote isn't likely today. Maybe there will be another one at some point this week that can maybe reopen the government again.
I mean, do you see a verifiable, a measurable difference in the way that blue states are being treated during this shutdown and red states, Republican states? Because that is suggested by some, isn't it?
Yeah, it's certainly suggested by some, and there are some things that you could point to that you could say, well, this isn't happening in red states, like the National Guard troops going into places like Chicago and even in Oregon. Those are two blue states. Um, so there's certain things that you could point to and say, certainly this isn't happening in red states. I don't know if I'm comfortable saying that in a broad scope, but there are
Hmm.
definitely, little examples that you can certainly point to.
Okay, what about the National Guard, lastly, Ben, and the administration's wish to deploy the National Guard to Chicago in particular, and claiming an uncontrollable level of crime there?
Yeah, I mean, you get counterproductive points from both sides on something like that. The Trump administration is very clear that they think that Chicago is a very dangerous place right now, and they want National Guard troops to go in there and try to clean up some of the crime. Well, Democrats say crime has never been lower in Chicago. So you get two different vantage points. We're really still waiting to see which one is going to win out. Illinois has done a
Yeah.
pretty good job at pushing off the National Guard to this point, although there are some. But to this point, that Illinois has been able to try to keep the National Guard for the most part out of Chicago.
Right, but crime statistics are a matter of record. So where is the truth in this?
Well, crime is statistically down in Chicago. That doesn't mean that, for the national, at a national scope that it's not up comparatively to everywhere else. So I do think that there's a little bit of truth to both sides of that.
Emily Sugarman is the Wealth and Power reporter at the San Francisco Standard. Welcome to you, Emily.
Hi.
All right, tell us more then. So there was a plan, we know, to deploy the National Guard to San Francisco. Then it was called off. What went on there?
Yeah, well, we were all preparing last week for National Guard troops to come into San Francisco this weekend. And then we heard directly from the president on Truth Social on Thursday that he was, in fact, not sending that additional group of troops into San Francisco. And the reason why is because he had talked to, quote, friends in the area, including Jensen Huang, the CEO of NVIDIA, Mark Benioff, CEO of Salesforce, and of course our mayor, Daniel Lurie. And they had convinced him that sending in the National Guard was actually not a helpful thing to do.
Curious, interesting story, Emily, isn't it? The apparent influence of friends of Donald Trump, who also happen to be local billionaires.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a really interesting moment to watch play out. Trump seemed pretty convinced about sending in the National Guard. And in fact, Mark Benioff, who was one of the people who called him to tell him not to send in the National Guard, had actually called for them to come in just weeks earlier. So interesting to see how people changed their minds, came together, and were able to change the president's mind as well.
Right, and by the way, this then applies to San Francisco. What about the wider Bay Area? Is the threat of National Guard troops going in there still active?
Yeah, we weren't sure about that late last week, but got additional clarity later that any kind of additional activities planned in the larger Bay Area had been called off for now. Of course, the president does keep saying, we'll see what happens.
Yes, and look, what about the original argument being used by the administration to send in the National Guard? It was about crime rates being out of control. This is your patch, your area. Are crime rates out of control in San Francisco?
I think the mayor has done a very good job of consistently citing the statistics about San Francisco that, our homicide rates are down, all violent crime is down, and that the argument being that San Francisco is actually making a lot of improvements in terms of, business, in terms of retail, and that sending in the National Guard at this point would actually just do more harm and cause more chaos than it would fix.
Right. Okay. So that is that. And I wonder, as you as a journalist in San Francisco, what do you say to the suggestion, which is part of the argument, that the Trump administration is targeting Democrat states and cities in the way in his deciding who to hit? What's your view on that, Emily?
I can't say what drives the president and what doesn't, but I do think that Daniel Lurie has made a very marked attempt not to antagonize him, which is different than we've seen leaders of other cities and states, and it seems to have worked well in this case. We don't know how well that's going to work in the future, but in this case, it is interesting to note that Lurie not talking about Trump, not challenging him and just getting on the phone and talking to him was helpful in this regard.
Right, and we do know that San Francisco is, as it were, a blue city. Tell me about the split of opinion in the city. Do San Francisco's divide, as so much of America divides on these questions?
I think everyone that I spoke to here was in agreement that we did not want the National Guard here. Obviously, San Francisco, people have a variety of opinions about how things should be run, about how the city should be run, but there was uniform agreement among most people that I spoke to that sending in the National Guard at this point would do more harm than good.
Okay, Emily Sugarman at the San Francisco Standard, thank you so much for your take on this as part of our regular Inside America